if President Biden, who I think had done really good things, was much more forceful and took more risk in the Ukraine, Harris might be president now.
In what way? What would have been more risk?
Well,
Allow them to use the missiles earlier?
Yeah, I think he could have actually said, President Putin, I'm 82 years old. This is it. We have to stand up for something, and I'm not going to pussyfoot around him. There needs to be risk-taking, especially when you're dealing with dictators and bullies, because that's the language they understand. And I don't think we were forceful enough.
Joining us now on Open Book is Professor Edward Goldberg. He's an NYU professor here in New York City. He's also an author of the book, The United States as Global Liberal Hegemon, How the U.S. Came to Lead the World. It's a fascinating exposition of a lot of different things going on in here. Of course, I love the book for a number of different reasons. Number one, before we started, I talked a little bit about Thomas Hobbes. We'll get into that, but also Dr. Kissinger is somebody that I've always admired. And without Dr. Kissinger, of course, I would have never been introduced to von Metternich and the whole treaty, the Congress of Vienna, which he wrote about in the early part of his career. But let's start with you, sir. Before we start on the book, tell us about your background and your career, if you don't mind. And thank you for joining the show.
Yeah, for sure. I started out actually in international business and international trade finance. And about 14, 15 years ago, I started to write some op-ed pieces, eventually wrote more pieces, wrote my first book, and NYU asked me to join the faculty, and I basically left trade finance to teach international political economy at NYU Center for Global Affairs.
That's a pretty fascinating, but why this book then, sir, and why now?
Okay, good question. What has been in my mind for a long, long time is why the U.S. is considered the leader of the world and who made it the leader of the world. Actually, the original title of the book, before Paul Gray Macmillan's editors changed it, was Who Anointed America? And who chose us to be the leader of the world and why? And interestingly, when I first started the book, I was kind of not so sure that it was a good thing for America to be the hegemon. Hegemon's the Greek word for leading power. And I thought maybe it's not such a good thing. I mean, I'm a kid of Vietnam. The Vietnam era. And, there were a lot of mistakes and a lot of people got hurt. And I thought, why are we doing this? What's in it for us? As I started to look at the history of it, as I started to look at the benefits of it, the world needs someone to organize it. And the world needs a liberal force, meaning not the current pundit word for liberal that's used all over the place, but the traditional word for liberal, meaning someone who believes in individual freedom and in free markets. The world needs a liberal force to lead it. And there's, frankly, no one else.
Well, when we hear hegemonic, though, sometimes there's a pejorative to that word as well, right? There's the hegemon, when you say global power, it also could potentially mean control, right? And there's a hint of imperialism around it. But you don't really mean it that way, right? How do you mean it?
I mean it with the liberal term in front.
Right. Okay. Okay, so the reason why I reference Hobbes, there's a very famous paragraph in the Leviathan. It's interesting because you were mentioning Jonathan Swift as we were getting started, and of course there's John Locke,
right,
and there's Thomas Hobbes, and so they're all interesting characters. Swift being more of the satirist of the three of them, but what Hobbes said, which has always left an impression on me, is that the world is at its greatest level of peace when there is one global hegemon that uses its military might to put down the internecine tribal conflicts in the world. And then he went on to describe Pax Romana and then, of course, Pax Britannia as two examples of this. And so the question I have for you, is America that still today?
Definitely economically. Definitely, I have a chapter in the book about the power of the Federal Reserve. And the power of the Federal Reserve has more or less become the world's fire station for putting out economic fires. It's actually kind of usurped the role of the IMF dealing with major problems. So yes, economically, and yes, because of the role of the US dollar in reserve currency. It's hard to do it. It's hard to be the liberal hegemon today without allies. And it's not Pax Romana, it's not Pax Great Britain, where they could move around the world and play any game they wanted. We need allies, and allies are a force multiplier. And it's interesting, in today's semi-globalized world or globalized world, whatever you want to call it at the moment, it's the allies who more or less select who the liberal hegemon is going to be. I mean, we don't force France or Germany into the coalition. They in a way chose us, as did Japan, as did Australia, as did the Netherlands, and you can go on and on.
Okay, makes sense. In the book, you write a lot about balance of power, and you write about the need for, I guess, the world. When you have a balance of power, it's almost like a form of deterrence, right? You don't have one group that goes to attack the other group if they feel like there's other balancing things on the other side. And obviously, I don't know, just going off of your book, since 1945, we've done a pretty good job of balancing power. Is that fair to say?
Well, we definitely had somewhat of a balance of power with the Soviet Union based on, the MAD concept. Back to John von Neumann's thinking of mutual assured destruction. And that basically worked until the wall fell down. Now, I'm not advocating the wall being built up to have a new balance of power, for sure not. But the MAD policy more or less worked. But the MAD policy was very interesting because it was based on the rationality of your opponent. If your opponent was a true ideologue and didn't care that they would destroy the population, of course, the MAD theory doesn't work.
Okay. Let me ask you this, though. In light of what happened with the Ukraine, was there a fault in the system? Is that something that America could be blamed for? Is that something that should not have happened? And if it should not have happened, what could we have done geopolitically to have prevented it from happening?
Well, I think, once again, we have to look at the fact that since 1648, in the end of the 30 Years' War, there's been called this Westphalia treaties on the idea of sovereignty. One country doesn't invade another country, very simply put. I mean, that's what World War II was about. In 94, Russia, the Federation of Russia, signed the Budapest Memorandum, guaranteeing the territorial independence of the Ukraine on the concept that Ukraine would give back the nuclear bombs that were stored there during the Soviet Union times. Ukraine gave back the bombs. They signed, the agreement was signed. It was co-assured by the US and the UK. Then Russia invades the Crimea. The world basically did very little. Russia then decides to invade the basic Ukraine. We, in a way, we gave them arms, but we gave them arms with one hand tied behind their back. I mean, I could even theorize that if President Biden, who I think had done really good things, was much more forceful and took more risk in the Ukraine, Harris might be president now.
In what way? What would have been more risk? Allow them to use the missiles earlier?
Yeah, I think he could have actually said, President Putin, I'm 82 years old. This is it. we have to stand up for something, and I'm not going to pussyfoot around him. Now, obviously, he did the prudent thing. I'm not saying he was prudent, but I think there needs to be risk taking, especially when you're dealing with dictators and bullies, because that's the language they understand. And I don't think we were forceful enough.
Okay. But we have been pretty forceful over the years, though, right? I mean, we were forceful in the whole Bosnia-Herzegovina situation. We were forceful.
We were there, but then, and I mentioned this in the book, I think Obama made a huge mistake when he made a red line and didn't live up to it. If you're the liberal hegemon, by definition, in one way or the other, you have to be the cop, as you mentioned before. And if a cop doesn't give out tickets, no one respects a cop. You're going to speed on the New York State Thruway if you never get a ticket.
Yeah, I just find the whole conversation fascinating because we're now shifting. It feels like the Charles Lindberghs and the Huey Longs that were trying this idea of isolationism 80 years ago have won. Now, they've won narrowly. It feels like Donald Trump is saying that, quote unquote, we're in forever wars and we need to retrench and pull back and so forth. And I guess what I'm wondering is, do you think he means that? Do you think that we will maintain our status as what I would describe as being leader of the free world? Or what do you think?
You know the man a little better than I do, okay? But, I hope he's just playing poker. I think he's playing a very dangerous game of poker. I mean, I don't know if you can retreat out of the world anymore. It's not the 1920s. It's not Charles Lindbergh. The economy is now basically globalized. Globalized for the economy, I mean, we're no longer an industrial economy. Industrial economies are passé. We're a human capital economy. Fixed assets are not as important, how many steel mills you have. What's important is how many Silicon Valleys you have. Once again, human capital. And the Silicon Valleys need to do business all over the world. Google needs to do business all over the world. Facebook needs to do business all over the world. I don't know how you can retract from those markets anymore, as the global economy has changed to be an economy of human capital.
But I mean, yes, and I agree with everything you just said. But I guess there's a broader and perhaps existential point that I'm asking you to respond to. Our grandfathers, and in some cases our great grandfathers, said, "Okay, the First World War didn't end so well. We botched the treaty. The League of Nations failed. We asked for too many reparations from the Germans. They responded with this perversity of dictatorship and nationalism, which ended up as National Socialism and ultimately ethnic cleansing and obviously, anti-Semitism." There's feelings like that right now in our society. At least I feel that way. And I'm wondering if there's anybody like our grandparents or the George Marshalls of the world, or Dean Atkinson, the Secretary of State for Truman, the Truman Doctrine, any of these things, that you write about it brilliantly in the book. The ideas to get us to this status, are they now being denounced? Are there still enough people in the world, or at least in America, that believe that this is important? Is it important? Yeah. Should somebody else take our place, or what do you think?
There's honestly no one else to take our place as a liberal hegemon. Obviously, there's the Chinese or the Russians would like to take our place or share in hegemonic power. But for sure, they're not what we consider our model of liberal capitalism. So is there a voice here in the United States? It has not been expressed correctly. Biden, who did some, I think, very positive things on building allied relationships and strengthening the idea of the hegemon, wasn't able to voice it to the American people. He lacked that leadership skill. Tony Blinken was a great Secretary of State in that respect, was not able to sell it to the American people. So we have a vacuum in terms of leadership there now. It's interesting, I think, and fascinating that our new Secretary of Treasury has been pretty much an internationalist all his life and a globalist.
Yeah.
So he's the one person that stands out in the new administration.
Interesting. I mean, I'm just fascinated with all of this because I feel like, and I don't know how you feel about this, Professor, but I feel like I'm a direct beneficiary of the thought process of these men, mostly men, at the end of the Second World War. They set out the GI Bill. They put in place a system. They put in place a system that led to great prosperity. They created the Marshall Plan, which was counterintuitive, but it fortified those democracies and protected them from Joseph Stalin, which made bigger markets for our goods, which allowed our blue-collar workers to get high wages in the late 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s before the inflation started. And what am I missing? Am I wrong about any of that?
I totally agree with you. I'm trying to recall the title of Dean Acherson's book, There at the Creation.
Present at the Creation. Present at the Creation.
I mean, you had a group of individuals, Marshall, Acheson. It's an amazing team. George Kennan, part of that team. You can go on. And you had Harry Truman, not a Harvard-educated person, but a very wise and pragmatic person bouncing that team. And it really put together the world that we had. And now we're saying, possibly because of the rapidness of technological change that society is not used to, possibly because that technological change put a part of the system into severe economic injustice, possibly because of the how rapidly cultural changes in the United States. For many various reasons, we're saying, hey, let's throw that system out.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, I'm flabbergasted by it. I am totally flabbergasted by it and don't understand the mood of the country at the moment.
It's almost like we forgot what got us here. That's the thing that I don't understand. And there's it requires leadership, and it feels like there's a lot of adversarial propaganda that's in the system that a lot of people have bought into, where they are, I don't know, they're peeing on the U.S. You know what I mean, which sort of makes it. I don't know. It bothers me. But to your point, I don't see the leadership explaining to the American people the virtues of all this. And it feels like the American people 80 years ago, after fighting that war, didn't need the explanation. The explanation was prima facie. So what would have to happen to renew this, I guess, is the question.
Sadly, I think to renew it, is we're going to need a crisis. It's funny. I've thought a lot about this. How do you unite folks in a democracy? You unite them through crises. I was always surprised with George Bush after 9/11. The weeks after 9/11, he had the whole country that he could have led and didn't do something like a gas and oil tax or something like that when he could have. And everyone, no one would have been against him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And FDR, of course, was the master of using crises to build coalitions.
Mm-hmm.
So, unfortunately, in a democracy, I think that's what you need, a crisis.
The world faces these new problems, right? We have climate change out there, pandemics, financial challenges, this threat to our political culture that you and I are describing. Let's say I made you the czar. Let's say I said, okay, you're a great student of history. You understand what's worked for us and what hasn't. given everything that I just said, what would you recommend to the country? Let's say that you were sitting before the new president or a group of leaders in the Senate. What would you recommend?
Ooh, that's a tough one. First, actually, something basic. Civics should be taught again.
Mm-hmm. Yep, no question. Yep.
Basic. Second of all, that we rethink Ronald Reagan's executive order about limiting the fairness doctrine in communication industry.
Okay, so we have a lot of young listeners, sir. So tell us what the fairness doctrine is and how it led to the rise of talk radio and ultimately talk TV on the conservative channels and so forth.
But basically, there was what was called a fairness doctrine by the FCC, where basically the networks had to take neutral political stance, more or less. And Ronald Reagan did away with that doctrine. And at the same time, the purpose of the way the doctrine was able to be enforced was because the government, now I'm not a legal expert here, but the government legally controlled the airways. Mm-hmm. With cable, the government doesn't control the airways. Mm-hmm. So one could say whatever one wants on cable. Mm-hmm. But I think, although it would be questioned constitutionally, I think we have to also look at the German constitutional amendment on hate speech. We have to get back to Oliver Wendell Holmes' famous quote about, you can't scream fire in a crowded theater. And that's exactly what's been happening here in political communication for the last 10 years, and screaming fire in a crowded theater.
I find the book to be very timely because it explains how we got to the position as use your words, a global liberal hegemon, how we became this very prosperous country and by and large benevolent country. Yes, we had some misstarts and failed wars, but they were generally trying to do the right thing, which was to keep the peace, if you will, around the world, suppress communism, suppress terrorism, etc. Not saying it always worked out our way, and not saying that we didn't have some failed missions, but in general, we've tried to do the right thing. And now we're at a crossroads again. So we're at the point in the podcast, sir. I don't know if you've listened to my podcast, but we put together 5 words and we ask our author to respond to these words, really taken from your book. And so you can give me a 1-word answer or a 1 or 2 sentence answer. If I say the 2 words foreign policy, you say what?
I say how the U.S. should act around the world.
Okay. If I say isolationism, what do you think of?
I would think of walls, whether it's tariff walls, whether it's walls against the world, whether it's walls against migrants. We build, and this is, I think, very important analogy that I've been thinking about. We build marginal walls.
Yeah.
Because they're false walls.
Yeah. And so just again, for young viewers, what the Maginot Wall or the Maginot Line was, the French built these major fortifications in terms of trying to protect themselves from Germany. But in fact, the new technologies like aircraft and the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, it became very easy for the Germans to go around these walls. And so I think the professor's trying to make the point that the walls, they seem like they could potentially work, but they never really do, right? The Berlin Wall didn't work, frankly, and so many other things. So walls typically don't work. If I say the 2 words United States, you think what?
A dream, a hope, a very unusual experiment, the only multi-ethnic democracy that even tries to work in the world, really something that could be very positive.
Yeah, I mean, or as Lincoln said, right, the last best hope for mankind. It's this beautiful thing that we have to try to figure out a way to renew. I mean, one of my problems is that we have 27 amendments, but we haven't really we had a procedural amendment in 93. Our last big meta amendment was in 1965. So that's 59 years ago. Yeah. It's just too long without another amendment. We should be, this is a living document. We're not amending it anymore. and it's putting a lot of stress in the system.
Well, think of this: the Senate. Wyoming has 2 senators. California has 2 senators.
Yeah, yeah,
Obviously, the Wyoming voter has much more power than the Californian
yeah.
voter.
No quitting makes you want to move to Wyoming, right? Because
Yeah, exactly.
you got a lot of muscle in Wyoming. How about if I say the word NATO or the acronym NATO?
Once again, NATO. I think a brilliant policy put together by Truman, Acheson, and Marshall that's kept peace in Western Europe for 75 years.
Okay. What about free world? I say the free world. You say what?
Free world. I think of the free world as a public relations remark by someone in the Eisenhower administration.
Right, but it's stuck, right?
It's stuck.
It's stuck.
Right.
Yeah, pretty interesting, right?
Right.
So, all right. Well, sir, the book is awesome. The title of the book is "The United States as Global Hegemon: How the U.S. Came to Lead the World," and it's written by Edward Goldberg, a professor at NYU. Thank you so much for joining us today on Open Book. Really enjoyed it.
Really enjoyed speaking. Had a lot of fun.